because they don't care about you. They're there to make money.
Right.
Right? That's
Right.
all it boils down to. And then we just see how history treats people. We don't know how history is going to treat people, right? I would have never thought, I'm obsessed with history and psychology. I would have never thought history would treat George W. Bush so well, right? Like he was on Ellen doing the Carlton dance 2 years ago, right? It's like this guy killed a lot of people,
Well,
right? This guy
how
crashed the
soon?
economy.
How soon we forget though? That's the whole thing. And
Yeah,
you
this guy crashed the
also,
economy, right? And then he's on Ellen, like, oh, I'm painting now. I was like,
well, think about it though. People are
it's like,
so
bro, people were
people
throwing
now.
shoes at you
People are
during press
obsessed with
conferences.
Well, think about it. People hated George Bush at a certain time. I remember he got the shoe thrown at him when the first time he went to
Two
not the first
shoes.
time. Two
That
shoes.
guy
Yeah.
missed both. That guy missed both times, bro. Both he missed with both shoes.
I cried laughing. I cried laughing because I saw it as it happened, and I was just happened to be watching the news at the time, and
Sure.
I cried laughing. But neither. My point is the way people hate Trump now. Bush looks like he's
Oh
so
yeah.
far in the rearview mirror that the hatred for him isn't there. But let me ask you about you were getting into about taxing the rich. Now, this is the thing. I think this is where we're at in the country right now. There's a whole argument of I do believe that, America has some problems, but I do think we got to incentivize people to actually work. I tend to think, and I know people might kill me in the comments, but I tend to think Americans, we're a little bit entitled. You know what I'm saying? Now, New York, in some ways. Now,
No, no, and but Shy. Once again, we talked about this last time. Opposing thoughts, right? It's okay to be like, you know, the track. What was that song? Beyonce's track with Kendrick. America has a problem, right? It's okay to be like, hey, this country has its issues,
yeah,
and it's still the greatest country in the world, right?
I totally agree with that.
I don't see people dying on rafts to get to Cuba. I see people in Cuba dying on a raft to get here. What does that tell you? If
100%.
we break down the actions, I see people fleeing from countries that are under the fundamentalist Islamic regime to this country, only to
Right.
come here and be like, this place sucks, and it's like, you know what I think sucks? Olive Garden. Do you know where I don't go? Olive Garden. I don't go to the Olive Garden in Times Square and stand on the table and be like, death to Olive Garden. This place sucks. I just don't go in there.
You just don't go. Well,
Right?
you know
Why
what,
do you
and
come
also
here and then
too,
tell us how much it sucks? That's really annoying,
I,
actually.
I tell people like abject poverty, the poverty we have in this country, and I'm not saying anybody should love poverty, but poverty that we have in this country versus real poverty to me is a lot different. Like
The poverty
just
we have in this country is like you have a smartphone, but not the newest one.
exactly.
Yeah.
I listen. I just a side note. My son was having he's involved in multiple things: karate, piano,
Sure,
summer camp,
sure.
all this stuff, right? So he was having a day one day. He's like, Dad, this is like 2 weeks ago. He's like, Dad, I'm just having a bad day. I'm just, he's having a lot of pressure because he's like a brown belt in karate and all this stuff now. He's like, I'm just having, people don't know how hard my life is. I was like, look, I said, come here, let me show you something, and I began to show him kids who are really in poverty, who are living in rubble, whose
Shy,
parents are dead. You know
you
what I
don't even
mean?
have to
Like,
do that. You could just show him. I've known you a long time. You could just show him what you did to get him a house, right? Like how hard you grinded, right?
no, I
You
had to, I
grinded that
had,
hard. You worked that hard so he
no,
could have a
I had to
better
show,
life.
no, I had to show. I feel you, but I had to show him kids who have
Yeah,
real problems. But
real problem.
just the whole thing is it's all perspective. So I think that as far as our country, I think that I was having this conversation yesterday, like I keep saying, with a friend of mine, and I thought about our conversation today. Is that I think people right now are at a point where just going to work, just doing what they normally do, they feel subjected. They feel like to your point, I've grinded, you grinded, a lot of people grind. And I think
Still
people
am. We
now,
still are. Yeah, it
we
doesn't
still
ever
are.
stop.
People feel like,
No.
oh, I'm being subjected just from working, so even in the things that Mandamini is trying to promise, minimum wage $30. You're gonna make $30 to work at Burger King or something.
That's
Um,
fine, but then a Whopper is going to be $45. You know what
correct,
I mean? So
correct,
yeah,
absolutely. And I was telling my friend, we were talking about this, and he's like, yeah, it's just people have a lot of poverty. I said, I get it, but at the same time, the thing that people don't understand is the cost of doing business. And to your
sure.
point, as far as um the literacy, the financial literacy of most people, yes, people are not going to always understand finances, but I think people have to understand both sides of business. And it just goes to the point of, yes, being a tenant, you got to understand the cost of being a property owner. And in New York, just to your point, we were talking about taxes. The rich already pay a lot of taxes in New York. So let me ask you, have you heard from any of the developer clients or anybody else, how do they feel as far as doing business in New York? Do
Well,
you see
one of the
people?
wisest people I know, the gentleman who told me about the Judas goat, he told
Mhm.
me I saw this all coming, so he actually moved most of his business and operations to Florida. About I think 15, maybe 20, like in the process, he said they're making it impossible to make money here. Right now, everybody needs to make some money, so to speak. Right. So, but in general, listen, New York City will always come back. Right. Smart people, financially literate people will say, okay, this guy's got 4 years. I'm calling bottom. The property will get cheap. They'll snap it up. And then, okay, if this guy does a terrible job, if he gets elected, 3 years, all of a sudden it's going to be like so and so's coming. And then the market's going to come up. Right. And I think we saw that happen after the election. Right.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
saw the
Yeah.
market run up like crazy after the election. Right.
Yeah.
It's going to be the same thing with housing or rentals in New York City. Right.
Mhm.
Uh, I right before we got on, I was looking at some financial stuff, and it's 4 months ago, J.P. Morgan said there's a 70% chance of a recession in the second
Right.
half of this year.
I
Today they
remember that.
came out and said the bull market is going to start in July.
Right.
So you can't even trust. It's so funny because when Goldman and J.P. or Morgan or whoever is saying like it's a recession, blah blah blah, it's like they're probably just saying that to drive the price down. Like we
Yeah.
can't trust these people.
Right. I was having the same argument with
They
people a
said,
couple
Shy,
months ago.
they said definitely a recession second
No, I
half of the year.
remember. I remember Jamie Dimon and other people saying that, but I was like, no, because those are the same. Listen, I totally agree
But
with you.
they drove the market down.
Of course, but they were, they're exactly, and the whole thing with tariffs. I was saying a couple of months ago. I'm like, okay, people are like, oh, Trump is destroying the market. I said the market is going to bounce right back up. This is all speculative. It's noise. It's news. The fundamentals never really change, right?
Not
So,
not on good
you know what I mean?
businesses, right? Yeah, not on
Yeah.
good business. But everything comes back to people not saying, "Well, what's the downside?"
Right.
Right? Nobody actually genuinely said with the Fair Act or with this, "Well, what's the downside?" Right? Because you always have to weigh the downside, right? A very good friend of mine, he buys, he's a big investor in Tesla, right? And
Hmm.
there are multiple times where, because he's a very good friend of mine, he says to me, "Hey, Tesla's down. I think you should buy some today," right? And the
Hmm.
first thing I think in my mind, right? What's the downside, right?
Hmm.
And then when I think about what the downside is, and I'm not going to get into it because it's not factual, right? It's speculative. I say, you know what? I'm just going to go invest in Berkshire Hathaway B shares, right? So while I've invested in Berk B shares and he's invested in Tesla, like I've missed out on some huge gains. But there's
Right.
also anyone who semi pays attention to the news. There's times where Elon does something crazy and right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I chose the more right. Okay, Berkshire Hathaway shares are not going to triple in the next year,
Sure.
right? But what's the
That's
downside, right? There's way less downside, right?
something you can
So when
stomach.
someone says anything to me like, "Hey, you can get a great deal on this," like, okay, what is the downside?
Right.
And people don't think like that because if they did, they'd say, "Hey, we're proposing this bill that's going to ban brokers' fees. If you're a tenant, you don't have to pay. The landlord has to pay." Right? My first question is, "What's the downside? Where's the fee going?"
Hmm.
But nobody wants to ask that.
Well, let me
I
let
don't
me
know.
ask you this, Key. Let me get your perspective on this too, and you can just tell me whatever you
Sure,
think
sure.
about it. So the question is, the cost of living. It's a big dynamic issue. I don't expect any one person to have the answer, but New York is obviously extremely expensive, like many places, just like California is extremely expensive. Now the question is, I think there's narratives. So there's one narrative that says that, okay, look, it's part of a larger problem. It's just part of the way America's going. And then the other thing is that all the rich people are the problem. And I tend to think, here's the thing, I tend to look at it and I say, well, okay, maybe some rich people could be a problem, but I don't necessarily think that it's about, because I think the narrative, we're selling people that, oh, the rich are the issue. And it's because all these greedy landlords, they're greedy. So
Well, you
In
need a
New York,
boogeyman always, right? Just throughout
yeah,
history, right? You always need a
ex-
boogeyman.
exactly. So
Yeah.
In New York, what do you think the issue is as far as the cost of living? I mean, what is your perspective as far as that? Because you live it. You're in New York too. You pay bills like everybody else.
I
You know what I mean?
mean, when it comes to housing, I think the bright, and I'm not Warren Buffett. I'm not any of these people, right? But to me, it almost seems almost too simple, right? Because you say, okay, look, roughly we have 100,000 or more apartments being warehoused due to this rent stabilization law. So the landlord just lets them sit empty, right? Now, if you were to abolish this law and say, okay, you can renovate it and bring it to free market, right? Like free market value. So you could take your one bed in the West Village that's $800 that hasn't been upgraded since '78, and you can put in the washer dryer and the herringbone floors. You can make it all nice. Market rates, let's just say $6,000, right? What that does is that floods the market with 100,000 apartments, right? Hence, the supply of apartments goes up. Most of them are going to be renovated. Okay, that will level out the rents because you have
Hmm.
more apartments in the market. The rents are being kept artificially high, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
It's like you purposely go to. I'm trying to think of a better example, but if you go to the Rolex store and they say, "Hey, we made 10,000 of this watch," right?
Right.
Versus we made 1,000 of this watch, right? So
Right.
the supply is so limited. They could flood the market with supply if they got rid of the rent stab law, right? But they don't want to do that.
Now,
And
the
yeah,
are the warehouse. Just a quick question about the warehousing. Is I know you handle most of Manhattan. Is the
it's
warehousing
happening all over the
happening?
five boroughs. Yeah.
Oh, it's happening everywhere in all over New
Yeah,
York.
Queens, Brooklyn, whatever, right? But so if you're a landlord and you own 10 buildings, right, and you have to warehouse 6 units, it's not the end of the world. You could write it off depreciation, right? But if you're someone who worked very hard and you bought one multifamily building in Brooklyn, it's got 4 units and two of them are rent stab, and your
Mm-hmm.
taxes are going up every year and you're paying water, sewage, heating oil, right? Because almost every apartment in Manhattan, heat and hot water is included,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you're paying all these costs, and the taxes continue to go up every year, but you can't charge the tenants more because they're rent stab, or you have to let it sit empty because it's, fair market is 4 grand and you have it sitting stabilization $800. Now you're taking a loss on the building. What do you have to do now? You now have to sell it to a bigger guy, a bigger landlord, because he can take that loss. He can
Got it.
stomach that risk.